to bring her up. She's going to explain what we're going to do, but you have a couple handouts. Mostly what we were looking at, using kind of funding formula study, 50 state K-12 funding formula comparison. So you have that packet, and she's got some teamwork going on in the room. So if we have really good questions, we could get some other people up to the mic that are excited to get to the mic. And so welcome everyone, and Jennifer, take it away.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Jennifer Light, KLRD. I do have two wonderful other people from KLRD up here today who are not normally in this committee. So we have Elena Rutter and Julia Kofoid. So close every time. So they did help work with these memos and have also done research into the 50 states. And so if there is something that I cannot answer, we will see if they can answer. And if they cannot answer, we will happily look into it further for you all. We're going to start with the 50 state K-12 education funding formula memo. So this memo compares kindergarten through grade 12 funding in all 50 states as of March 2024. Let's start with the primary funding model. This is determined either with students or resources in most states. In a student-based model, districts receive a base amount of funding per student with additional money or weights added to provide additional services and supports to students with unique needs. There are 35 states and the District of Columbia, including Kansas, that use this model. Other states use the resource-based model in which districts receive funding sufficient to pay for minimum required resources, such as staffing, services, or programs. And there are 9 states that use this model. There are 4 states that use a hybrid model of both students and resources to determine funding. These states are Georgia, Illinois, Maine, and Massachusetts. And then 2 states, Vermont and Wisconsin, use a separate funding model from those listed. Vermont uses a model which is called the Education Fund. It couples the state's education finance system with local property tax administration. So the spending for schools in that is approved at the local level by the school boards, passed by the voters. It is then funded by the property tax rates and education yields annually, which is set by the legislature. Wisconsin uses an equalization aid formula to determine their funding, and it's known as the cost share formula, and it involves both state and local districts, which are contributing to fund the total cost determined by aid from 3 different tiers of calculations. And you may ask, how is that different from what Kansas does? Kansas also has local contributions. And the answer is that when we're talking about the actual funding for the state, Wisconsin is counting local contributions and state combined when they have that discussion, as opposed to Kansas, which talks about state contribution, and that's when we talk about state aid. So there is local contributions in Kansas, but they are not considered part of the state aid portion of the funding. Base amount. So as I think we all know in this room pretty well now, but the base amount is the minimum guaranteed dollar amount per student that each state may allocate to each school district. This may or may not have an inflationary requirement and an inflationary measure. There are 32 states, which include Kansas, that have base amounts. Other states that include this are Colorado, I'm just highlighting a couple, Missouri, and then Oregon is also one of the ones that does it this way. There are 18 states that do not use a base amount at all. Nebraska is one of those, and I like to highlight the states around us. So, as far as weightings and funding mechanisms, there are a number of different ways that states allocate their funds to school districts for different school populations. These methods are known as weightings or funding mechanisms and are usually enacted through state code or statute. But they can also be found in the educational agency's bylaws or a handbook. For each population, a state may choose to utilize one of the defined funding mechanisms below. I'm going to run through these as definitions now, but they are, when I refer to them later, if you're confused, we can come back to this page, but this page does have the entire group of the types of mechanisms that can be used. So these include single weight, which is a single percentage, which is used to multiply by the base amount to provide supplemental services for students or districts. Multiple weights, which means that each weighting's percentage is multiplied by the base to differentiate the student need or the program. Categorical, which is an allocation of funds to school districts through different funding streams external to the primary funding model. Census-based, where funding is based on attendance or enrollment counts for the overall student body rather than on the demographics within a district. High count services funding, where reimbursement of school districts receive a reimbursement for a particularly high-cost service, often related to special education. Reimbursement, individual school districts submit receipts of eligible expenditures to the state, and then the state reimburses for all or a portion of the expenditures. Resource allocation, in which state allocated funds pay for specific staffing positions or programming, and then a hybrid, which is using a combination of any of the above. In special education funding, there are many ways that states currently use to determine special education state aid, ranging from reimbursements to census-based and hybrid of or multiple different weight measures. Kansas uses a reimbursement rate. There are four states in total that do so. The other three are Michigan, Nebraska, and Wyoming. The hybrid model is the most commonly used for special education, and there are 27 states, including Colorado, that do so. And the hybrid model can include things like awards, the census, specialty allocated funds, and the weightings. There are 9 states plus DC that use a multiple weighting system. And the weightings can differ, but they include things like enrollment, IEP levels, and types of disability. The 9 states also include Oklahoma, as well as DC. There are 4 states that use a single weighting for special education funding mechanisms. Now, each of these are slightly different, so I'm going to run through them specifically. Louisiana does a single weighting for students with disabilities who have an IEP. Maryland, as of fiscal year 2025, is a special education per pupil amount, which is weighted at 99%. For Missouri, special education students with an IEP rating of at least 13.11% as of fiscal year 2024. And then in South Carolina, we have they also do students with disabilities who have an IEP. 2 states use a high-cost services funding model. Connecticut appropriates an amount calculated at 4.5 times the school district's current expenditures for each pupil in special education. Rhode Island appropriates 4 times the core foundation aid for each school district, for each pupil. 2 states use resource allocation funding, and these are Delaware and Mississippi. Delaware uses a student-to-unit ratio to decide the amount of resources needed, and this means that they look at the intensity of needs and services compared to each student. Mississippi uses a 3-tiered system to determine their resource allocation funding. Tier 1 receives 60% of funding, Tier 2 receives 125% of state funding, and then Tier 3 has 170% of funding. Finally, both North Carolina and West Virginia use a categorical funding mechanism for special education state aid. Mr. Chair, I'd be happy to stand for questions as we go, or would you like me to just continue as we move along?
Do you have any questions so far? It's kind of high overview, big comparison to other states, so we're enjoying listening to you. Doing great.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Then there is the English language learners weighting. Similar to special education funding, when states determine aid for English language learners, the same sections of mechanisms are used. There are 2 states that do not have funding at all for English language learners. This is Mississippi and Montana. Kansas uses a single weighting system for English language learners. There are 19 states in total that do so, and the other states include Missouri, Nebraska, and Oklahoma. In Kansas, this is referred to as the bilingual weighting. There's a multiple state weighting systems, which 16 states use. And a lot of the states use this for proficiency, grade level, and the number of ELL students in the district as their weightings. And the 16 is 15 states plus DC. So these states include places like California, Massachusetts, and North Dakota. There are 5 states that have a hybrid funding system. These states include Colorado, Page 5, we talk about resource allocation with English language learners. 5 states use a resource allocation model for ELL state aid. This is based on counts of ELL students, but the specific determinants for the counts and programs are different for each state. These 5 states are Illinois, North Carolina, Virginia, Washington, and Wyoming. 3 states use categorical funding mechanisms. This is Delaware, Idaho, and West Virginia. And then finally, 1 state, Wisconsin, uses a reimbursement rate for English language learners aid. Bottom of page 5 is low income. So funding for low income students uses the same funding mechanisms previously discussed. There are 7 states that do not have funding for the student population. These states are Alaska, Florida, Georgia, Idaho, South Dakota, West Virginia, and Wisconsin. There are 14 states plus DC that use a multiple weighting system. Kansas is one of those. We do the at-risk and then the high-density at-risk. So when you're talking about the weightings for low-income students, those are the 2 in Kansas. Other states who also use this funding system includes Colorado and Nebraska. And in Kansas, we identify students for this aid based on their eligibility for free and reduced lunches. And I believe the rest of the states do as well. I'm getting a nod, so yes, the rest of the states do use the same identifiers for the low-income students. There are 17 states that use a single weighting system. These include Hawaii, Mississippi, and Oklahoma. There's 5 states that use a hybrid funding system for low-income students. California uses multiple weights and also does categorical state aid, which I'd remind you is the money that is not within the primary funding formula. Iowa does census-based and state weighting. Maryland does single weight and categorical. New Hampshire does single weight and multiple weights. And then Virginia does resource allocation and multiple weights. There are 4 states that do resource allocation for funding low-income students. Funds for these are allocated based on the number of students from low-income students. Funds are allocated based on the number of students from low-income situations in each school district, the number of instruction hours needed per week to provide learning assistance, or the students being counted as 1.0 FTE. These 4 states are Illinois, North Carolina, Washington, and Wyoming. Finally, 3 states use the categorical funding mechanism for low-income students. They're Alabama, Delaware, and Montana. For gifted and talented students, there are 13 states and DC that do not currently fund these programs. These states include California, Missouri, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Vermont. The other 37 states, including Kansas, uses a funding mechanism to allocate funding for gifted and talented students. In Kansas, we use the reimbursement funding mechanism within special education state aid for our gifted and talented students. There are 12 states that use a categorical funding mechanism to fund their gifted and talented services, which include Alabama, Florida, Montana, and Utah. 10 states use single weighting systems, including Oklahoma. 6 states use a resource allocation funding model to fund programming for gifted and talented. Delaware uses 1 resource unit per 250 pupils. Mississippi provides an adequate education funding program salary schedule based on the type of certificate and the numbers of years that the teacher has had for the gifted teachers, plus the employer's rate for Social Security and state retirement. So it's based purely on the teachers and what their levels are. Ohio provides additional funding for gifted students to cover costs associated with full-time equivalent coordinators and intervention specialists. Virginia funds 1 FTE instructional position per 1,000 students. West Virginia provides an allowance for students enrolled in advanced placement, dual credit, and IB courses. And then Wyoming, in Wyoming, the gifted and talented students are counted in prototype elements in the program that is their main funding program. Finally, there are 5 hybrid funding mechanisms, or 5 states that have hybrid funding mechanisms: Alaska, Hawaii, Idaho, Iowa, and Washington. And then there is a single state, North Carolina, which uses census-based funding for gifted and talented students. There are 14 states that also include funding for small size or isolated amounts. These states do include Kansas. This is the low enrollment weighting here in Kansas. There are 14 states plus DC that do not have any sort of allocations for this, and the rest fall within these categories. So 21 states have a multiple weighting systems similar to Kansas. Kansas's low enrollment, there's a weighting system for students under 100 or students between 100 and 1,600, roughly, students. Other states that also include multiple weights include Colorado and Oklahoma. There are 6 states, including Missouri, that have categorical funding for this, 5 states that use resource allocation, and 3 states, including Nebraska, that use a single weighting system. South Dakota is the solo state that uses hybrid funding mechanisms for small size or isolated schools, and it uses both resource allocation and categorical funding to add additional funding. And that is a high-level overview of at least the weightings and the primary funding formulas in the 50 states. Mr. Chair, I'd be happy to stand for questions on this or move on to the surrounding states.
Well, first of all, it's just pretty impressive to do a 50-state comparison and list all that out. So kudos to you and your team. Any questions? Representative McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was just trying to think of examples of some of these. If a state uses lottery funds, for example, would that be considered categorical because it would be external to?
Mr. Chair, it would depend on how the state's funding formula is set up. If the lottery funds are tied into their primary funding formula, then it would be considered part of the primary and not categorical. If it is something where it is not listed specifically in the primary funding formula, that would be considered external outside of it. So it really depends with the lottery. It would depend on where the state decided to put the allocations for that sort of funding.
Any other questions, comments? Representative Brantley?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and this is excellent. Narrowing down to just the kind of the numbers for this, do we know how we compare with our student pupil expenditure compared to other states?
Mr. Chair, I do have that information, but I don't have that information up here where it's easily accessible. I'd be happy to follow up with that information for you.
Sounds good. Great question. Representative Owsley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Jennifer. I doubt this was part of your assignment, but I'd be curious what the what other states' constitutions say as far as their education clauses. We know in Kansas our education funding formula, our K-12 formula, has been sent to court repeatedly throughout our history, and it has repeatedly held up. Same with our special education funding mechanisms, and I'd be curious just to see how we compare, if there is a comparison. I'm not even positive there would be a comparison as far as constitutionality or constitutional clauses go.
So, Mr. Chair, I do know that there are other states who do include the education within their state constitutions. I don't have a listing of that up here with me, but we'd be happy to look into that and get some more information for you about the differences, either Nick with the revisor's office or KLRD about constitutionality between the different states.
And then if we wanted to jump real deep down that rabbit hole, we could see what other states and constitutions have been upheld in court rulings and, see the history there. It'd be fascinating.
There would be a lot of history, but it would kind of be fascinating just with what Kansas has been through. I mean, that would be a long report. Representative Owsley, I'm gonna have you just stay on that. I need you to produce that report for the committee by next week. Hold on, Representative Wynn.
For clarification, if you're talking about the history of our court cases, we've had that report presented numerous times.
Representative Brantley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you again. You mentioned the small size or isolated districts. Can you clarify maybe which districts those might be or number-wise for Kansas? Does that make sense?
Mr. Chair, if I can go get my laptop, I can have an answer.
Just to have a voice while Jenny's looking something up, I will note, and we can do some further investigating, I will note that Kansas is not unique in its constitutional provision. Now, not every state has some similar constitutional provision that requires, for example, in Kansas, suitable provision for finance of the educational system. But there are other states that do have a similar constitutional requirement, whether it says suitable provision, adequate financing. I'm trying to think of some others. And other states have been subject to state litigation on their school finance formulas. And we could certainly kind of provide some background on those state constitutional provisions and whether that state has been subject to
Short
litigation.
follow-up on that. The ROSE capacities, do you remember other states tying it to those ROSE capacities?
Yeah, so that those ROSE capacities, I believe, came from school finance litigation in Kentucky, if I believe. So the Kentucky, I think that was under the Kentucky Constitution education article, and that's where the court kind of first recognized those as being educational capacities that you were looking to attain to provide suitable financing. But we can provide some background. I think we've got some information on some of those states and some examples.
Excellent, thank you. Jennifer, thank you for grabbing your laptop.
Mr. Chair, so as part of the Education Funding Task Force, we did pull numbers for each of the weightings for the task force on Monday. So these are weightings from the preliminary legal max for the fiscal year 20, or school year 24-25. They may change slightly over the course of the next several months as KSD does do its audits. But looking at the document, when we're talking about low enrollment, there are 3 brackets within the low enrollment section. One is for 0 to 99, and a couple of those districts in 25 would include Rolla and Fowler. Rolla is USD 217, Fowler is USD 225. Then we have low enrollments for 100 to 200 to 299.9. A couple of those include, this is where I should have practiced my pronunciation for every school district. Shilen, see, first one, 103, USD 103. And then another one of those would be Thunder Ridge Schools, which is 110. Then there's a low enrollment weighting for 300 to 1,621.9. A couple of those would be Erie-Galesburg, and that's USD 101, or Meade, USD 226. So those would be just a couple of examples within the 3 different weightings. If you would like, Mr. Chair, I'd be happy to send this document to the entirety of the.
Yeah, I know it probably would be pretty easy since we had it in our task force. So whoever wants it, or if everybody wants it, just be in an email if you want to check it out. Good information in it. And really what this is, to me, is all about, and I think we think about this committee's role in passing out the budget each year. The formula really dictates 95% of it, 98% of it. And so, getting the formula right is a big deal, and it's up in 27. And so if you make it through another election, and come back to this committee, that's when we'll be voting on it. But we're going to try and prepare hearts and minds for trying to get that right. And I think there's some good things about ours, and we're going to start to dig in the task force, on the special education. I think that's where we have some difficulty, and just thinking about other options or just funding it like we've kind of been fighting for. And so anyway, I say all why we're doing some of this review is help you get your mind wrapped more fully around probably the biggest project for this committee. And I know it's also over in a task force that's getting, kind of the bulk of the responsibility to look at options. But those ideas will then get referenced right here. So just trying to build a base for your understanding to where we know what we're talking about as much as possible. So, Representative Steele.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and amazing. Thank you so much, Jennifer. So it looks like every state potentially has, if they don't have the base rate, they just have weightings? I'm curious, I guess maybe more where my brain is going. Is there a state that has a way higher base rate because they just incorporate everything into, I'm just going to throw out a number, like let's just say it's 12 grand for every student, whether they have sped or not, because I may need a lot of services and someone else may not need anything. I'm just like, is there anything like that?
Mr. Chair, it is entirely possible that that is the case. I'd have to go back and look at the numbers we were using to gather this all up, to put into the 50-state memo to double check that, but that is a very reasonable assumption that there'd be a higher amount in base if people are not using, but using weightings. I'm looking at my table and neither of them are looking at me, so I think we're going to have to get back to you on that as far as how that is working, I think.
So if they don't have a base amount, because there's only the 32 plus DC, so those would just be under weightings? And if you need to go back and look, it's totally fine.
I'm just trying to think. I thought I maybe, sometimes my binder saves me right here at the very end that I've just put all sorts of things in.
I
Okay,
think,
so when we talk about base, we're talking that is a minimum guaranteed every year.
yes.
And so if you are not one of those states who are doing a minimum guaranteed every year, the number can change, but you no longer have that minimum guarantee. That's why we call it a base. So the number can fluctuate more than what the states are who are using a base.
Interesting. Okay.
And it is possible that KSD has an answer for that, if you would like to let them. Apologize, I thought I heard something that I did not hear, so I will look into that for you.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, I guess I don't know, maybe it's just too simple. If you just did a higher rate and that's just what it is, and then that rate goes up every year with inflation or whatever.
Yeah, I mean,
No, it's far too simple because you've got all kinds of
complexity. And I mean, I think you can see, I think almost what this does for me, this report, is it honors the complexity of our state. Because each state is doing it in a unique way. There's constitutional matters at stake. There's different levels. There's different ways, and kind of just gives the beauty of our country a little bit, that there is freedom to explore what that state wants to do for education and enact it. Representative McDonald.
This is just a little bit of commentary. 2 or 3 times during the Education Funding Task Force meeting on Monday, I kept hearing the chair in particular talk about how we need to simplify everything. And I think that maybe as humans, that's our nature, to just simplify everything. But I would argue that there are a bunch of ways to do this because there are a bunch of different unique needs in each state. So I want us to push back a little bit on just simplify, just throw everything out and just make it simple because, we do have unique challenges in Kansas that other states don't. And maybe I noticed there were states that don't even fund ELL. Maybe they don't have the need that we do. So, I think I just want to push back on the notion or the preconceived idea that we're going to simplify, because that's not always for the best.
Yeah, noted. I mean, even just further commentary on right back in the other direction. It's kind of, sometimes things do need to be simplified because they have been left to a complexity that is no longer necessary. That there was a time where the complexity was needed, and now we don't necessarily need that anymore. And to simplify where it makes sense. Simplify with rationality. I would definitely agree with that. Or keep it complex because it's a complex issue. And that's, we're going to have to delineate some things very much like that in the coming days, the coming years. So appreciate the comments. Yeah.
Mr. Chair, I do have,
Go ahead, and then we'll go to Representative McNorton.
I have something from the back of my brain, so I'm going to tell you that I'm going to double check this to make sure it's right. But I believe that when we're talking about base, we are also really focused on the student-based side of it all. And there are states that do resource and not student-based in their counting. And so I want to be clear that just because we're saying that there are states that are not doing a base, that is most likely because they are doing the resource-based allocations and not because of the difference. I will double check that, but that is what is.
Not having any base seems like a pretty crazy system to go into each year after year after year, not necessarily knowing what the base is. So whether it's off of teachers or off of students, maybe that is. Representative McNorton.
So this is a more question, I don't know who, maybe you, but, so the task force is going to redo or revamp the funding formula.
I'm gonna ask you to stop looking at me and look at the chair, the actual, no, I'm just kidding. But yeah, we do have an expert in here of how it's gonna go if it's a technical question.
So the task force, so they're going to come up with something. Is the body, this committee, who's going to approve, or what's the whole process? How's that going to happen, I guess? I just am not sure how that.
Representative Estes.
Thank you. The task force will meet, make recommendations, and then a law will have to be created and passed. And we have the academic year of 2027, if I remember correctly, as that great big looming deadline that keeps me up at night.
So it will come to the full body with a bill or that we will debate. Okay, I didn't know how that was going to happen. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Representative Poskin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Along those lines, is there any thing that prevents us from keeping the formula in place that has already passed the constitutionality? We're not required to change the formula, correct? It just expires and we could choose to keep the current one in place, yes?
I would let Nick, the expert, not my opinion, but statutorily, what would your answer be to that?
So pursuant to statute, and I could pull the statute, but the KISA school finance formula, there's one statute that says the formula shall sunset or expire on July 1, 2027. So theoretically, yes, you're correct that the legislature could repeal that statute and be moving right along with the same formula, for sure.
Representative Estes.
I guess I would caution on that because, like, our last meeting, one item that came up is there's a cap on what you can raise with transportation, and then the years that gas prices jump, you're kind of stuck a little bit for the state's portion of what that is. So I think it's very worthwhile to strategically go through and take a look at everything.
Agreed on both accounts. I want to redo the, oh, I'm just kidding. Jennifer, I see you gave us another packet. Representative Steele.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you refresh the committee who is all on that task force? Or maybe Representative Estes can. Thank you.
Not off the top of my head, there's some supers, there's some different people that I don't know, but what if we could just send that out to the committee? We'll send a list of positions to where then you get everybody, the ex officio and the voting members that you kind of know. If you want to ask a question of any of them, you can reach out to them. We'll get that for you. Representative McDonald.
It's on our Kansas Legislature website if you go in the top tab under Task Force, and we have our own page, so it's got a whole list.
We have our own website. I forget about that. All right, back to you, Jennifer. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, I do have that list here if you would like me to do it, to just say it now, or I can just send it out.
I think everybody can read it on their own. It'd be perfect.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The other document you have in front of you is a little bit deeper dive into the K-12 funding in Kansas and the surrounding states, which include Colorado, Missouri, Nebraska, and Oklahoma. So all 5 of these states do use a student-based primary school funding model for K-12 education. However, each state has a slightly different requirement for what is included within their funding model. So states can determine student count using either attendance or enrollment numbers. An attendance count is the total number of students who are present at school on a given day, while an enrollment count is the total number of students registered to attend the school at a given time. So in this room before, we've talked about that head count often is you can touch and play duck, duck, goose with every body in the, whereas the enrollment would be who is enrolled on the books for that day. So that's a little bit of the difference between attendance versus enrollment numbers. States can also choose whether these counts occur once a year or multiple times a year, or they can do it as an average across most or all of the school year. 4 of the 5 states use enrollment as the basis for their student count, including Kansas. Missouri is the only state that uses an attendance count rather than an enrollment count. Both Kansas and Colorado conduct a full student count once a year. In Kansas, that is done on September 20th, while in Colorado, the date is usually October 1st. Kansas does have a secondary count date, but that's only for military students, and so it's not considered a total count date, which is why it is that Kansas only uses 1 day. We do capture the military students who have joined school districts in February, but that is not a full count of the school districts. Missouri, Nebraska, and Oklahoma all use the average count method rather than a single or multiple student count day each year. As far as the primary funding model, 4 of the 5 states include a minimum guaranteed dollar amount for the students. Nebraska does not include such a guarantee. However, only 2 of the states include an inflationary requirement in their primary school funding model. These are Kansas and Colorado. As we are all aware, the Kansas's primary funding model for K-12 education is the state foundation aid, which includes the base amount per pupil, and the base amount in fiscal year 24 was $5,088. And as of fiscal year 2024, Kansas's base increases yearly by the 3-year average of the CPIU Midwest. Colorado has a primary funding model of, which is titled the District's Total Program, which is a student-based model, which also includes a base. The base amount per pupil in fiscal year 2024 was just under $8,077, and in fiscal year 2025 is just over $8,469. Colorado, like Kansas, has a requirement to account for inflation, but it is a discretionary amount rather than being tied to the CPIU Midwest. In Missouri, the primary funding model is the State Foundation Program. It is also a student-based model. In fiscal year 2024 for Missouri, the base amount was $6,375, and in fiscal year 25, it is the current school year, it is $6,760 per student, but Missouri does not have an inflationary requirement for their base amounts. In Nebraska, the primary funding model is the Tax Equity and Educational Opportunity Support Act. The act, like the others, is a student-based model, but there is no base amount included in the primary formula. However, during the 2023 session, the Nebraska legislature added an additional $1,500 per student in foundation aid. Foundation aid is one factor in their overall primary funding formula. In fiscal year 2025, 100% of this foundation aid is required to be included as a formula resource, and then for fiscal year 2026 and every year after, 60% of the foundation aid is required to be included as a formula resource. There is not an inflationary requirement for the $1,500 per student or the primary funding model overall. In Oklahoma, the primary funding model is called foundation aid. It is a student-based model, which includes a base amount of in fiscal year 2024 was $2,122 per student, and in 25 is $2,137. Oklahoma also does not have an inflationary requirement for the base aid. We have talked a lot about weightings. We're going to talk a little bit more about weightings. For purposes of this memo, we only looked at two weightings. We looked at English language learners and low-income students. In the English language learners section, all 5 states include ELL funding within the primary K-12 funding formula. Kansas, Missouri, Nebraska, and Oklahoma all have a single weighting mechanism, and Kansas includes the Kansas's weighting system includes using the higher count either of FTE students or the head count of students who use ELL services. Missouri's single weighting provides an additional 60% for students who are above the limited English proficiency threshold, and in 2024, that threshold was 2.29%. So if you are above that, according to the district, you would count for the 60% weighting. In Nebraska, the ELL weighting is calculated using the lesser of either the school's designated maximum ELL allowance. So the school district can designate, each school district in Nebraska can designate a maximum amount that they are willing to use or willing to use. Or you can use the calculation based on a standard weighting per ELL student. And then Oklahoma's single weighting provides an additional weight of 25% per ELL student. Colorado is the only one who does not use single weighting. They have a hybrid ELL funding mechanism. The state includes both a weighting within their district total program, and they provide categorical grant funding. The weighting is an additional 8% for each student, and the categorical aid funding, which is outside of the primary funding model, school districts are eligible for funds based on the student or a district's characteristics. And in fiscal year 2025, the categorical aid amount is $34.6 million for Colorado. For students with low-income backgrounds, all 5 states do include funding for these students within their primary funding models. All 5 states also do use the free and reduced lunch students as the identifiers for these students. Oklahoma and Missouri both have a single weighting for students from low-income backgrounds. In Oklahoma, the weight is an additional weight of 30% per student, while Missouri provides 25% per student who is above the free and reduced lunch per pupil count threshold. In Missouri, in 24, that threshold was 30.95%. So once you are above that 30.95%, then they start counting the students for 25% of each of those students. 3 of the states use multiple weightings for these students. In Kansas, we use both an at-risk weighting and a high-density at-risk weighting, and the students may qualify for one or both of these weightings. Colorado also includes both an at-risk weighting, which is an additional 12% per pupil, and a high-density at-risk weighting for school districts with a higher than the statewide average percentage of at-risk students. It is split into two levels after that: school districts with a student population of 500 to under 50,000, and school districts with a student population exceeding 50,000. At the first level, the 500 to 50,000, for every 1% of the at-risk students above the statewide average, there is an increase per student of 0.3%. At the second level of school districts that have over 50,000 students, for every percent of at-risk students above the statewide average, there is an increase of 0.36 percentage points. The state also does include a limit on their at-risk factor, that no district can exceed 30% for the at-risk weighting. So they have a cap on the at-risk spending. Nebraska's weighting for students is calculated using either the lesser of the school district's designated maximum allowance, or the calculation based on the standard weighting, which is in their statutes. And these percentages in Nebraska for low income, they have multiple percentages, which range for districts between, so the percentages range from 3.75% for districts who have between a 5 and a 10% of students qualifying for it, up to 22.5% for districts who have more than 30% of their students qualifying for the poverty allowance. So there is multiple levels and then multiple percentages within their weightings for low-income students. So it's more of a stepped or a tiered system in Nebraska. And that is the weightings overall. We will move off of weightings for you all now. Pre-kindergarten funding is also within some of the states. For the 5 fund pre-K, at least partially through the primary funding model. Colorado is the only one of the 5 states that does not include any funding for pre-K in their base model. It does provide for it in a separate appropriation. So it is not part of the primary, but there is funding for it. It's just not considered part of their base or their primary funding model. As far as special education, which is the last section and the last time you have to hear me talk today, there is funding for special education students in all 5 states, although only Missouri, Oklahoma, and Nebraska include it in their primary funding model for their states. Missouri includes it as a single weighting for an additional 75% for students above the special education threshold, and in 24, that threshold was 13.11%. I also want to point out that Missouri is the only one of the 5 states that does not include any funding for their gifted students. Oklahoma's primary funding model includes weightings for specific disabilities. I have them listed here. I'm not going to read them all for you, but they are listed for you. And then gifted students are also included as a separate weighting in the primary funding model with an additional weighting of 34%. Nebraska does special education funding as a reimbursement to school districts. So similar to Kansas, districts submit receipts of eligible expenditures to the state, not state, and then receive 80% of the previous year's total allowable excess costs for all special education programs and services. I want to point out that is different than how Kansas does it because it's based on the previous year's numbers, which I thought was different and unique, so I wanted to call that out for you. Nebraska does have categorical aid for their gifted students, and in fiscal years 24 and 25, that amount is $2.3 million each year. So there was $2.3 million for gifted students in fiscal year 24 and $2.3 million for gifted students in fiscal year 2025. As you know, Kansas also provides state aid in the form of reimbursement for excess costs, set in statute at 92% of those excess costs. In fiscal year 25, we are at $6.1 million allocated for special education state aid, which is 75.4% of excess costs. We are still, as you know, working through the budget this year, so I didn't want to put in the number that was the final number for this year. And Kansas includes their gifted students in the students who receive special education state aid. Finally, Colorado has a hybrid funding mechanism with both a weighting systems and then a high-cost services funding. For the high-cost services funding, the state reimburses districts for particularly high costs, and there's $4 million per year for this, which are used to reimburse school districts for a student that exceeds $10,000 or $100,000 or 2.5% of the operating expenditures for the school district. Reimbursements are awarded based on application and approval by the Special Education Fiscal Advisory Committee. And then for the multiple weightings, the administrative units receive $1,750 for each student with disabilities. And then they also receive up to $6,000 for students with specific disabilities as set by the Department of Education and approved by the Colorado Legislature. Beginning in fiscal year 2025, these funding amounts must increase by inflation. Colorado also has categorical aid for their gifted students, and in fiscal year 2024, this categorical aid was $14.7 million. With that, Mr. Chair, I'd be happy to stand for questions.
Again, great job on pulling together some awesome information. Do we have any questions? Representative Owsley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Jennifer, I respect that you didn't put the final percentage in here as we're still working on the budget process, but if the 10 million in additional SPED reimbursement sticks, what would be that percentage?
I believe it's about 73%.
73.5. I remember it being when you showed that to me. 73.2.
73.2.
Thank you.
Representative Brantley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On page 4, you talked about the pre-K program. Can you tell me what 5 states included the pre-K in their budget?
So these are the surrounding states. So when we're talking about it in this memo, we are talking about Oklahoma, Missouri, Nebraska, Colorado, and Kansas. So Colorado is the only one that doesn't. I do want to mention that pre-K is not a universal in Kansas. It is for at-risk students that it's included in the base. So thanks for circling back around on that, so I could clarify that it is not all students.
Thank you.
Representative Steele.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Did you say there was a base for pre-K? It's not just SPED funding and at-risk funding? There is a base for them?
So in the finance formula as it stands now, we include pre-K students who are at risk as part of the initial grouping of adjusted enrollment numbers. So they are included in the base FTE count if they are at-risk preschoolers.
Thank you.
Representative Estes.
Thank you. Do you have an average of what gets spent in each of these? And have you laid them out on a CP under the Consumer Price Index? So it's interesting to me, the different methods, and so that's why I'm curious what the average they would spend and how we compare to each other. And I always find this CPI helpful.
We might try and pull that for next week sometime. It just because it was asked a couple times on basically cost per pupil, kind of averaged out over these surrounding states. Unless we want to go broader, but I think these would give us something to work off of, and just those numbers would be a good request. Representative Brantley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As we think about that in the 5 surrounding states, I would like to add those NAEP scores that are at the top and how much funding they're providing to their student. So if the higher NAEP, what is their pupil funding for their state? Does that make sense?
Basically states that are doing well on the NAEP score, what is their funding base, and might create a little deeper dive, but just look at which states are the top 10 on NAEP and see what their funding per pupil is, And we can then reference back to this to see what kind of setup they have in their funding formula. Representative Estes.
That's actually an interesting exercise because I did it for myself last year with who was highest and lowest on NAEP and then the CPI on top of it and where Kansas compared, and the results were very surprising.
Okay. Well, committee, let's thank Jennifer one more time. Great research. And her team. And with that, there is nothing for the good of the committee. We are adjourned. Thank you, everyone.